Hey y'all, this is Dan with the Hemp Highway of Kentucky, welcoming you to another episode of Off Ramps from the Hemp Highway of Kentucky. Today's episode, the USS Wasp. We're going to learn today about the intersection of Marine Oakum, World War II, and a ship called the USS Wasp. So first of all, what is Marine Oakum? It's another product that comes from hemp. It's basically shortened hemp fiber that has been twisted and used as caulking for naval ships. And sometimes it may get a little bit of tar, so it's a little bit more water resistant. But it's used especially during the time when ships were built of wood and during the age of exploration. A lot of times ships were pegged together using wood pegs. And everything was kind of flushed, and so you had to jam it with this hemp fiber caulking called Oakum to keep things watertight. And so Oakum is extremely valuable in shipbuilding, and it's also extremely critical in damage control and ship repair while you're out at sea. If a wooden ship hits a big storm, the caulking may come out, and they have to be able to recaulk the ship to keep it from sinking or to keep the cargo dry. Likewise, you wouldn't believe it, but in a landlocked state or territory like Kentucky, Oakum is extremely valuable. Kentucky is a frontier state, and it's the first territory opened up west of the Allegheny Mountains. Our only major access to market is in New Orleans. So goods coming from central Kentucky have to float down the Kentucky River to the Ohio River, to the Mississippi River, down to New Orleans. And they do this on flatboats, all right? So a typical Kentucky industrial site will have warehouses, and will have a mill operation, and they'll have a boatyard. And that boatyard may have a rope walk nearby. And they build these flatboats, and they peg them together, and then they shove a bunch of this hemp oakum caulking in there to make them watertight. And then they float all the products down the river. And the oakum is critical because without it, I mean, these are glorified rafts, these Kentucky flatboats. They're glorified rafts. Without the oakum, not only might they sink, but your products are going to get wet. They're shipping tobacco and flour and liquor and hemp, and none of this stuff can get wet. And so the oakum keeps everything dry. And so it's a real critical part of the Kentucky economy. So that's what oakum is. And even though it's critical on wooden ships, it doesn't lose its importance when we start to see the shift to the ironclad or to the metal ships, because early construction methods aren't perfect, and you still have seams and joints that need to be sealed. And so you're still sticking oakum into the seams and joints. And as ships get plumbed or have piping for steam or water, oakum is used in pipe fitting to keep the pipes from leaking, to keep them to hold pressure. So it's this critical material, not just on the frontier, not just on shipbuilding during the age of exploration and when we had wooden ships, but even into metal-based shipping. Following the First World War, the major combatants were eager to avoid that type of conflict and bloodshed, and they set about negotiating a series of treaties that would limit the size of each nation's military, and this included their navies. And in 1922, the Washington Naval Treaty is held, and the 5 participants are the United States, the United Kingdom, Italy, France, and Japan. And the idea is that they are going to limit the size of the navies that can be built under the treaty, and they do that by assigning each class of warship a total tonnage amount that could be built during the time the treaty's in effect. And so, for example, there's a difference between a destroyer and a battle cruiser or battleship, and the difference between a destroyer and a shore patrol ship. And so under this treaty, the total amount of tonnage allowed for aircraft carriers is 130,000 tons to the United States. The treaty gives the United States the ability to have more ships than Japan or Italy or France. So the United States has 130,000 tons, and they're going to build 3 aircraft carriers under the Yorktown class, the Yorktown, the Enterprise, and the Hornet. Except for when they're designing the ships, they realize that they need a bigger ship so that they can make it faster with more a bigger power plant, and they want to have more airplanes on it. So they need a bigger ship, and then to protect it, they need more armor. And so all of a sudden, they go from building 3 23,000-ton ships to 2 27,000-ton ships, and that would be the Yorktown and the Enterprise. They're going to take the remaining tonnage, and they're going to make a smaller ship, and this one they determine is the Wasp. Now, the difference being is that the Wasp is basically the Yorktown shell. It has the same size flight deck, it has a lot of the same dimensions, but it doesn't have as powerful of an engine, and it doesn't have armor around its waterline to protect it from torpedo attack. And so what you have is essentially the chassis and engine of a 1973 VW Volkswagen with the body of a Porsche. All right, it looks good, but it's not going anywhere. And so this aircraft carrier is the last ship designed under the Washington Naval Treaty, and the keel is laid down for the Wasp April 1st, 1936, and construction is completed, and she's commissioned a little over 4 years later, April 25th, 1940. And at this time, a article runs in the Kentucky newspapers showing that all of the Oakum, the stuff used to seal any of the seams, and at this point being used to connect piping and make sure the piping is all watertight, all of the Oakum on the USS Wasp comes from Kentucky River Mills. So Kentucky River Mills supplies the Wasp when she goes out to sea. So the Wasp is commissioned April 25th, 1940. She sails to Norfolk Naval Base, where she begins her sea trials and qualifying her flight crews. And this is of note because during the qualification of flight crews, Lieutenant Junior grade David McCampbell becomes certified, and he would go on to become the Navy's top scoring fighter pilot ace during the entire Second World War. So that's kind of neat. Wasp finishes these sea trials in September 1940. She is given her full-time assignment. She's assigned to the Atlantic Fleet and to Carrier Division 3, which is based out of Norfolk. One of her first assignments out of that is to take a squadron of Army Air Corps fighter planes, P-40 Warhawks. She loads them on the deck, takes them out into the ocean, and they launch off the aircraft carrier. So they prove that they can launch land-based fighter planes from the deck of an aircraft carrier, which may serve purposes later on. So after that, it's kind of nondescript. The Wasp does some duty in the Caribbean. Meanwhile, the battle for the Atlantic is heating up in the North Atlantic, and this is where the German U-boats are trying to strangle the British and the Russians by attacking the merchant shipping that is supplying the British and the Russians with raw materials and weapons of war. Britain's an island. It doesn't have vast resources. It gets raw materials and it gets weapons of war. The raw materials come from its colonial empire. The materials of war and fuel are coming from the United States on these boats, and the Germans know that if they can stop the boats from getting to England, the English army will starve in the field. And so they take their submarine force and they attack the merchant shipping. Conversely, the British Navy is engaged in anti-submarine warfare, and the United States, even before the war starts, is involved in a certain amount of convoy escort work. FDR has launched what's called the Lend-Lease program, which allows the British and the Russians to purchase materials of war or to lease them without paying cash at the time. And slowly he's expanding the distance that the American Navy is allowed to escort these convoys back to the battlefront. And so the Wasp is really well situated for this because she can do anti-submarine warfare, and since the German strategy is to sink merchant ships and not warships, the exposure she has from being under armored around the waterline isn't really exploited by the Germans. That's not their goal. So she does this for a while, and when the war starts for the Americans, for America's entry into the war, she continues to do these things. Her first real action is Operation Calendar, which occurs in April of 1942. The British control the island of Malta, which is in the middle of the Mediterranean. The island controls all the shipping lanes, and the airplanes flying out of the airfield in Malta can provide air covers. So the Germans can't resupply the Africa Corps that has been rampaging through North Africa, or in Rommel's army. So the Germans think if they can take Malta, then they can supply North Africa, and they'll have all the raw materials and resources that can come from North Africa. The British need to get some airplanes down there because their air force has about been wiped out. They take on aircraft. The Wasp takes on aircraft, British Spitfires, in Orkney, Scotland, April 14th, sailing towards Malta, April 19th. They get through the Strait of Gibraltar, and they launch the airplanes on April 20th. So planes fly, they get there, everybody thinks it's great. The Wasp starts heading back to Britain. German intelligence has tracked the aircraft, and as soon as they land, they hit the island with this incredible aerial bombardment, and they destroy them all on the ground. And Churchill asks Roosevelt for a favor: can we do this again? And so this time, under Operation Bowery, there are two aircraft carriers. There's the Wasp, and there's the Royal Navy HMS Eagle, and together they're going to bring 64 British Spitfires down to Malta. They are leaving around May 3rd, and they go through the Straits of Gibraltar. They launch the aircraft, all 64 of them. One of them has to land back on the aircraft carrier for whatever reason, for lack of fuel. But this time they resupply the island, and they're successful. On the way home, the German radio is boasting that they sank the Wasp. Meanwhile, Churchill gets on the radio, and he starts crowing about how a wasp can sting twice. So while this is happening, there's a lot going on in the Pacific that's going to attract attention. At the exact same time that the Wasp is engaged in Operation Calendar, resupplying the air squadron on Malta, the United States Navy is launching the Doolittle's raid on Tokyo from the deck of the USS Hornet. When the Wasp and the Eagle go back to Malta to run more airplanes to the RAF squadron there in early May, the United States Navy in the Pacific is engaged in the Battle of the Coral Sea, which is significant for a couple of reasons. The most significant reason is a strategic victory for the Allies. They thwart Japanese plans to invade Port Moresby, New Guinea, and cut off supplies to Australia. At the same time, the United States loses the aircraft carrier USS Lexington to being sunk, and the USS Yorktown has been heavily damaged, and it's estimated she'll take months to repair. Yorktown gets back to Pearl Harbor. U.S. intelligence has determined that the Japanese are intending to invade Midway, and in the miracle of the Yorktown, she is repaired within 72 hours and is operational to join the Hornet and the Enterprise when they meet the Japanese at the Battle of Midway, which is a strategic, crushing victory for the Allies, but it does result in the Yorktown being sunk. So the strategic decisions made to transfer the Wasp from the Atlantic Theater to the Pacific Theater. Wasp goes to Norfolk to do some minor repair work. Then it transits through the Panama Canal to San Diego to pick up new aircraft. And then it's scheduled to join the Southern Pacific Fleet for the invasion of Guadalcanal. However, on the trip down there, She develops engine trouble, and that puts her out of commission for about a week, and she misses the initial landings. So Wasp joins the carrier task force and the invasion force about a week late, and she provides air cover for the Marines. She provides convoy duty, escort duty, providing protection for the ships that are running up and down what's known as the slot in the Solomon Islands. And it's during this duty, which is some of the most heavily contested of the war, that the Wasp will meet her fate. On September 15th, 1942, the Wasp was on escort duty, escorting transport ships during the Battle of Guadalcanal, southeast of San Cristobal Island, along with the USS Enterprise. During a time where she was caught with her anti-submarine patrol aircraft on flight deck refueling, she was spied by the Japanese submarine I-19, who quickly launched 6 torpedoes. 3 of them slammed into the underprotected side of the USS Wasp, immediately igniting some fires and causing significant damage to the damage control operations, so they couldn't initiate firefighting or repair on the aircraft carrier. And she was eventually abandoned by her captain, and she was ordered sunk by the destroyer USS Lansdowne. Now, the Japanese fired 6 torpedoes. 3 of them hit the Wasp. 2 of them slide by, with 1 of them hitting the destroyer, USS O'Brien. While the ship doesn't immediately sink, it causes some structural damage, and about a month later, in rough seas, the damage snaps the boat in half, and they have to sink her. They have to scuttle her. The last torpedo hits the USS North Carolina, which is a battleship, and punches a hole in her. She can be repaired at sea, probably using some marine oakum, and eventually puts into Pearl Harbor or a similar type of station for more full-on repairs that last about a month and a half. And I'm sure there was some oakum involved in there. In 2019, the wreck of the Wasp was actually identified and located by underwater archaeological teams, and her site was recorded for posterity.